The letter offered £40 if Selah Vane would sign away every claim to her father's name before sundown. Josiah Trent set it on the table between them, a pen already dipped in ink. "Take the money," he said. "There's rot in that tower, and nothing else." Her father had died in the lamp room 18 months earlier, and the company's report called it his own carelessness. She had never believed a word of it. Refusing the money meant refusing everything, but the condemned light itself, hers through a clause, Trent clearly hadn't expected anyone to read closely. She refused. That night, she climbed to the lamp room alone, carrying her father's tool roll, the only inheritance she trusted. The great lens sat dark and cracked, but beneath it the clockwork drive turned freely, though no one had wounded in a year and a half. Someone had been inside the tower recently. She traced fresh oil across 2 gears that should have seized from disuse, and her hands went still. Trent's carriage was already moving down the coast road, faster than an honest man's business required. She sat with the mechanism a long while after the sound of the wheels had faded, turning the drive gently with 2 fingers, listening to it run smoother than 18 months of salt air had any right to allow. Her father had built half of this mechanism himself, replacing parts the company never bothered to order from London, and she knew its voice the way other daughters knew their father's handwriting. It was not rusted silence she heard tonight. It was upkeep. Somebody had been keeping this light alive in secret, against every official record that swore the tower had stood empty and useless since the funeral. A note reached her the next morning, sent round by the vicar's boy, offering a position as governess to a family in Ipswich. Arranged. The note said kindly, out of concern for a young woman left with so little. Selah read it twice at the kitchen table of the cottage she'd have to give up within the month regardless, and wrote back 4 lines declining before she'd finished her tea. Ipswich would have meant a roof, a wage, and a life spent teaching other people's children in rooms she'd never chosen. It would also have meant leaving a mechanism that answered to careful hands the moment she touched it, and a company report that had called her father careless while somebody, somewhere in this village, kept his work running rather than let it die with him. She packed what she owned into 2 trunks that afternoon: clothes, a few books, her mother's shawl, and left the rest with a neighbor willing to store it for a season. The cottage's lease belonged to the company too, it turned out, and Trent's clerk had already posted a notice for its next tenant before she'd so much as finished carrying the 2nd trunk out the door. By evening, she'd moved what little she owned into the keeper's quarters at the base of Gannet Scar Light, a single dry room off the storeroom that smelled of tar and old rope rather than damp. She lit no fire that first night, unwilling to spend coal she couldn't yet spare. She sat instead with her father's tool roll open across her knees, running her thumb along the worn handles. Touch alone told her which ones he'd used most often in his final months, and which had sat untouched long enough to gather the faintest film of rust. £40 would have bought a room in someone else's house, and a story everyone in the county already believed. What she had instead was a condemned tower, a clockwork mechanism that shouldn't be running, and a question she meant to answer properly before she let anyone call her father careless again. Marham Sands received her the way it received most bad weather, without much comment and without much welcome. She walked the half-mile into the village the second morning with her father's tool roll wrapped inside her coat, and found conversation thinning wherever she stopped to have it. The grocer weighed her tea without meeting her eyes and charged her a farthing more than she remembered paying with her father beside her. "Company's not fond of anyone stirring up old business," he said, when she asked plainly why the price had changed. "Your father's death settled quiet enough. Folk here would rather it stayed that way. My father built half that mechanism with his own hands. I'd think folk here would want it kept running properly, whatever became quiet or otherwise. Wouldn't argue the point." He tied her parcel without offering it across the counter directly. "Only telling you what I hear said, not what I believe myself." She carried her tea and her thinning coin purse down toward the harbor, hoping to find honest work mending anything mechanical the fishing boats might need repaired. She found a woman there instead of the men she'd expected, sorting a tangle of net line with quick, sure hands, a pipe clenched unlit between her teeth, as though she'd given up smoking it years before, but never quite the habit of holding it. "You're the engineer's girl," the woman said, not quite a question. Dorcas Wren. Kept house for the last 3 keepers before the company let the post go, since nobody's held it official since your father passed. Selah Vane. I know the name. Half the village does, one way or another. Dorcas set her netline aside. "There's talk, you mean, to fight the company over the tower. I mean to understand what happened to my father first. Whatever comes after follows from that. Careful how loud you say it then. This village eats off, contracts the company hands out, one way or another, boat repairs, coal deliveries, the lot. Nobody's keen to lose that custom over a dead man's daughter asking questions." Dorcas studied her a moment, something careful shifting behind her eyes. "Doesn't mean nobody wants the questions asked, only that most of us can't afford to be the one asking them. Someone's kept that lamp mechanism oiled since my father died. 18 months of oil. On gears, the company's own report swears have sat idle the whole time." Dorcas's hands went still on the net line just for a moment before resuming their work. "Couldn't say who'd do a thing like that. Couldn't or won't. Might be there's a difference, and might be there isn't." Dorcas didn't look up again, though something in her tone had softened rather than closed. "You'll want dry stores before the autumn damp sets in proper. I sell what the company doesn't control, directly flour, candles, the like. Come by if you're short." Selah thanked her and was still turning the conversation over when a man in a company greatcoat fell into step beside her at the harbor's edge. Unhurried, as though he'd simply happened to be walking the same direction at the same pace. She recognized the coat's brass buttons before she recognized the man himself, an overseer named Prentice, sent round twice already to remind her that the storeroom she'd taken for a workshop remained strictly company property. "Village talk travels quicker than most folk realize," Prentice said, not quite looking at her. "Word is, you've been asking Mrs. Wren about who's kept that mechanism turning. Word is you've been asking a good many people a good many things this past week. I'm asking after my father's work. I'd have thought the company welcomed anyone taking an interest in keeping the light properly maintained. The company welcomes quiet, Miss Vane. Quiet keeps contracts flowing, and contracts keep this whole village fed through the winter, mine included." He stopped at the harbor road's fork, where their paths finally parted. "I'd think carefully before you make yourself the reason that quiet ends. Grief makes a person say things they can't easily unsay once a magistrate's taken an interest. Is that a warning, Mr. Prentice? Or merely an observation? Call it whichever helps you sleep better." He touched his hat, the gesture almost courteous, and turned up the lane toward the company office, without waiting for any further reply. Selah carried her purchases back up the coast road, turning the exchange over as she walked. Careful, not unkind. A village bound to a company's contracts, the way a tenant's bound to a landlord's good favor. Unwilling to speak plainly, but unwilling, too, to pretend the mechanism's fresh oil made any sense under the official story. Halfway up the rise, she stopped and looked back once toward the harbor, toward Dorcas already returned to her net line, toward a morning that had told her almost nothing directly, and a great deal regardless. She spent that evening in the lamp room with the mechanism, tracing every gear by lamplight. She worked until she understood its full working, the way her father must have understood it in his final year, patient and thorough, learning a language before she tried to read what it might tell her. The storeroom door had swollen shut against its frame years before anyone thought to plane it properly, and Selah spent her first free morning coaxing it open with tools better suited to clockwork than carpentry. It gave eventually, grudging, and revealed a space dry enough to serve as a proper workshop once she'd swept out the gull debris and hung her father's tools along one wall in the order he'd always kept them. She'd earned her first honest coin 2 days prior mending a fisherman's winch that had seized solid from salt and neglect Work simple enough for hands trained on Lighthouse clockwork. Word of it had apparently traveled faster than she'd expected, for a village so careful about which conversations it permitted itself. A second boat owner arrived before she'd finished setting her tools in order, a battered lantern in one hand and an apologetic manner that suggested he'd rather not be seen asking, "Heard you fixed Tam Osler's winch proper, first try." When the smith couldn't manage it in 3, he set the lantern on her workbench. "Wicks fouled somehow. Won't draw steady no matter how I trim it." She had it working within the quarter hour. The fault nothing more than a warped collar easily receded. She refused his coin twice before accepting it the third time he pressed it on her. Understanding that refusing entirely would read as charity, neither of them could afford to have noticed. "You're better with your hands than most men twice your age," he said, pocketing his mended lantern. "Your father taught you well enough, whatever the company's paper claims about him. You don't believe the report either. Company report says a careful man went careless overnight, checking a mechanism he'd checked 1,000 times before without incident." The boat owner shrugged, though his eyes held steadier than the gesture suggested. "I've known careful men go careless exactly once in their lives. Mind. Usually there's a reason, even when nobody's troubled to look for it." Micah Renwick found her at dusk, when the workshop's single lamp was the only light left burning along that stretch of the coast road. He stood in the doorway a long moment before speaking. A young man, perhaps a year or two older than herself, his hands marked with the particular calluses of someone who'd handled fine mechanisms rather than rope or nets. "You're using your father's bench," he said finally. "Third drawer sticks, unless you lift it slightly before you pull." "How would you know that?" "Because I've been the one lifting it. Near every week, for the better part of a year and a half." He stepped inside, slow, watching her reaction the way a man watches weather he can't yet read. "I apprenticed under your father the last 3 years of his life. Nobody at the company thought it worth continuing my indenture once he'd gone, so I've kept coming anyway. Unofficial, unpaid. I couldn't let the mechanism seize entirely, not after everything he taught me about what happens to ships when a light goes dark on a night it's needed." Selah set down the file she'd been holding, understanding, all at once, exactly whose hands had left oil on gears the company swore had sat untouched. "You're the one who's been keeping it running. Badly. And in secret. And never quite well enough to matter as much as your father managed it." "But yes." Micah's jaw tightened. "I've watched 2 ships take that shoal harder than they ought this past year, because the lens doesn't turn the way it should without proper hands tending it weekly, rather than whenever I can slip past the company's notice. Why keep it secret at all? If you believed in the work, why not simply ask the company to reinstate you?" "Because the company dismissed my indenture the same week they ruled your father careless, Miss Vane. And I've never once believed those 2 facts arrived by coincidence." He met her eyes steadily for the first time since he'd entered. "Why come forward now, then? You've kept it secret a year and a half. Nothing's changed since Tuesday that I can see, except that a stranger's moved into the tower and started asking questions. Everything's changed, far as I'm concerned." Micah moved to the bench and ran a hand along its edge, the way a man touches something he's missed without quite admitting it to himself. "I've watched this village decide, quiet and all at once, that your father simply grew careless one night after 30 years of never once being careless. I couldn't correct that alone. Nobody troubles to believe an apprentice with no proof beyond his own word and a set of borrowed keys. And you believe I've got more than that. I believe you've got his notebook somewhere, if he kept the habits he taught me. I believe you've got his patience for reading a mechanism properly, instead of guessing at it. And I believe, now that I've said all this aloud to someone besides myself in an empty tower, I'd rather risk being wrong about you than spend another 18 months carrying it alone." Some of the caution eased from his shoulders as he spoke. "Your father talked of you often, toward the end. Said you'd have made a finer engineer than half the men the company ever bothered training if anyone had thought to let you try properly." Selah found she couldn't answer that at once, and Micah, to his credit, didn't press her to. "I didn't come here tonight to frighten you," he said instead. "Quieter now. I came because I heard you'd moved into the tower. And I thought you deserved to know you weren't the only one who spent 18 months refusing to believe what the company wanted the whole village to accept." The company's local office occupied a narrow brick building near the harbor's better end, its ledgers kept, Selah had learned from Dorcas, by a clerk more sympathetic to the village than to his employer. She found Nathaniel Purcell at his desk on a gray Tuesday morning, a stooped man with ink-stained fingers who received her request with visible reluctance before producing what she'd asked for regardless. The maintenance contract's public record, strictly speaking, filed with the fund's trustees each quarter, he said, sliding a thin ledger across the desk. "Though I'll admit few enough people ever trouble themselves to read it closely." Selah turned the pages carefully. The contract's terms were plain enough on their surface. The Trent Maritime Lighting Company engaged, on behalf of the Mariners' Widows and Orphans Fund, to maintain Gannet Scar Light in full working order, funded by an annual sum drawn from the fund's invested principal. The sum itself, entered year by year in a careful clerk's hand, had grown steadily across 2 decades. "The maintenance costs claimed here," she said, "don't match what I've found in the tower itself. Half the equipment my father repaired with his own money, never once billed to the company or the fund. Lamp oil rationed so carefully, it barely lasted 3 weeks of any given month. I couldn't speak to what happens up at the light itself, only to what's entered in this office." Purcell's eyes moved to the door, then back, his voice dropping slightly. "Though I'll say the sum claimed each year has always struck me as considerably more than the work described could plausibly have cost, if the tower's truly in the state you're describing. Difference between the sum claimed and the sum actually spent. Where would that difference go if it isn't spent on the light?" "That's not a question my ledgers are built to answer, Miss Vane." Purcell closed the book gently, though something in his manner suggested he'd already answered it privately, whatever he felt able to say aloud. "I'll tell you plainly what I can. Mr. Trent's father held this same contract before him, and administered it much the same way, by every account I've ever heard whispered rather than stated outright. Whatever pattern you're tracing didn't begin with the sun." Selah walked back to the tower with the contract's figures repeating themselves against her footsteps, weighing them against Micah's account of rationed oil and unbilled repairs, against her father's death ruled careless. The same week his young apprentice was dismissed without explanation. 2 generations of Trent men administering a fund meant to protect widows and orphans, drawing its full allowance each year, while the light itself ran on her father's unpaid labor and Micah's stolen evenings. She understood, walking the last stretch of coast road in failing light, that the real inheritance her father had left her wasn't a condemned tower or a clockwork mechanism at all. It was a question 2 families had spent 20 years making certain nobody troubled to ask properly. Micah came to the workshop 3 evenings later with a length of iron bar tucked under one arm, unasked, and set to work on the sticking 3rd drawer before Selah had finished her tea. "Your father kept something behind the mechanism housing," he said, not looking up from his work. "I never opened it myself. Felt wrong, somehow, prying into what he'd hidden without him there to say why. You knew it existed and never told me. I only suspected it existed." He was careful. Your father. Careful enough that a careless man wouldn't have thought to hide anything at all. Micah set the drawer's runner back into its channel, testing it until it slid smooth. "I thought you ought to be the one to find it. Whenever you were ready to look." They climbed to the lamp room together, once full dark had settled, Micah holding the lantern while Selah worked the mechanism housing's rear panel free, with the same patient care her father had taught her for delicate gearwork. The panel resisted at first, held by screws gone stiff with salt, then gave all at once, revealing a shallow space behind the drive mechanism no company inspector had apparently ever thought to examine. A canvas-wrapped bundle sat inside, dry despite the tower's general damp, and beneath it a small tin box, its lid sealed with wax, gone brittle with age. "Go on," Micah said. When she hesitated, You didn't spend a fortnight learning this mechanism's whole language to stop short of the one thing it was built to protect. The canvas unwrapped to reveal her father's engineering notebook, its pages dense with figures and diagrams in a hand she knew as well as her own. Repair costs, oil consumption, gear replacements, each entry cross-referenced against the company's official claims with a precision that read less like a keeper's log and more like an accountant building a case. He was documenting the difference himself, she said, turning the pages toward the lamplight. Every shilling the company claimed to spend, set against every shilling actually reaching this tower. How far back does it run? Years. Further back than I'd guessed. She turned to the final written page, where the entries stopped abruptly, mid-column, the remaining leaves torn away close to the spine, and then it simply ends. Someone's removed whatever came after this. She broke the tin box's wax seal next. Inside lay a single folded letter, addressed to no one in particular, its ink faded but legible enough to read by lamplight. If anyone finds this before I've had the chance to finish it properly, I have proof enough now that the company has drawn full maintenance sums from the fund for years past while spending barely half on the light itself. I mean to bring it before the trustees directly, whatever it costs me to do so. I have told Trent as much to his face and did not care for how he received the news. The letter ended there. No signature, no further page. The same clean tear evident at its edge as at the notebook's final leaf. He confronted Trent directly. Selah said quietly. Before he died. Told him outright. He meant to expose the fraud. Micah was silent a long moment, the lantern steady between them. And a week later, a careful man went careless, checking a mechanism he'd checked 1,000 times before. The company's report never mentioned any confrontation. Never mentioned a threat to expose fraud that would have cost the Trent family 2 generations of income. Selah wrapped the notebook and the torn letter together, her hands steadier than the discovery likely warranted. Whoever tore these pages away didn't want anyone finding what my father meant to prove, and I begin to think whoever arranged his careless accident wanted precisely the same thing. The notice arrived by company messenger on a wet Thursday, addressed to Micah Renwick rather than to Selah directly. It accused him of trespass upon company property and theft of materials belonging to the Trent Maritime Lighting Company, with a summons to appear before the county magistrate inside the fortnight. He carried it up to the workshop still folded, his face carefully blank in the way Selah had already learned meant he was working hard to keep it so. Theft, he said, setting the paper on her workbench. For oil I bought myself, out of my own wages when I still had wages, and tools your father gave me outright before he died. This is because you've been seen here. Because the village knows we're working together now. Trent's clerk has eyes everywhere this custom depends on, one way or another. Micah's voice stayed level, though his hands, Selah noticed, hadn't quite stopped their restless motion since he'd arrived. A conviction ends any hope I've got of honest work along this coast again. No company will indenture a man with theft against his name, whatever the truth of the accusation. Selah looked at the summons, then at the man who'd kept her father's work alive for 18 months at exactly this risk, and understood precisely what Trent had aimed for. Not at her directly. At the one person whose testimony might someday matter. Removed cleanly, before it ever reached a room where anyone official might hear it. Stop coming here, she said. Micah's head came up sharply. That's not why I showed you the notice. I know why you showed me. I'm telling you what I've decided. She made herself hold his gaze, though it cost her more than she'd expected. I can finish reading that notebook alone, slower, without someone to check my work, but I can manage it. You have a whole future along this coast still ahead of you. And I won't be the reason a magistrate's conviction closes it before it's properly begun. You'll need a witness who can speak to the mechanism's true state when this finally reaches a room that matters. Then I'll find a witness who isn't already facing prosecution for the crime of keeping ships safe on a night the company couldn't be bothered to manage it themselves. She heard her own voice catch and pushed past it before he could offer any comfort she wasn't ready to accept. You've risked enough already, Mr. Renwick. I won't let my father's fight cost you every honest trade left open to you. And if I refuse to stay clear of it, then you're choosing that against my wishes, and whatever the magistrate decides, you'll have chosen it knowing the cost beforehand. She said it steadily, though her chest had gone tight with the saying. I'd rather manage this alone than watch you lose everything for a fight I started. Micah studied her a long while, the summons still creased in one hand. Your father used to say the company counted on decent men staying quiet, because quiet men rarely cost them anything. I always thought that was simply how he talked. Might be it was the truest thing he ever told me. Might be both. He nodded. Finally, though it plainly cost him to do it. At the door, he paused. Not quite leaving. I'll stay clear of the tower, if that's truly what you're asking. But I'll be watching this coast road regardless, magistrate or no magistrate. If that lamp goes dark 2 nights running, I'm coming up it myself, whatever it costs me afterward. She let him have that much, understanding that refusing it outright would have cost more than either of them had left to spend. He walked back toward the village without the easy stride he'd carried on every previous visit, and Selah watched him go until the road bent him out of sight. Then she turned back to the notebook with a clarity that settled cold and certain in her chest. Trent had learned exactly where to press, and exactly how little he cared, which honest man happened to be standing nearest when he did it. The wreck came on the worst night of the autumn, a collier running the shoal too close in weather that should have kept any sensible captain further out. Selah heard the first cries carried up from the rocks before she'd properly understood what the sound meant. Thin and broken beneath the wind, the kind of noise a person's ear refuses at first because the alternative is too plain to accept. She was in the lamp room within minutes, working the mechanism by feel in the dark. She found the drive seized entirely, the gear she'd meant to repair the following week, having finally failed under a strain 18 months of borrowed maintenance, had never quite managed to correct. The lens sat dark and useless above her, exactly as Trent's report had always claimed it should be. Exactly as her father and Micah between them had fought for a year and a half to prevent. She worked the mechanism with cold hands and a lantern too dim to see properly by, forcing the seized gear free by main strength rather than the careful precision the work deserved. She got the light turning again within the half hour. Far too late to matter, for whatever had already happened on the rocks below. Micah arrived as she was still bracing the gear with a length of borrowed wire, his coat soaked through, his face the color of a man who'd run the whole coast road without stopping. He said nothing for a moment, only took up the second lantern and held it steady where she needed the light most, and together they watched the beam finally sweep clean and full across water, already gone quiet, with whatever it had finished doing. Dawn brought the full accounting. 3 sailors drowned, 4 more pulled from the water half frozen. The collier itself broken across the shoal in pieces, too scattered to salvage cleanly. The harbor master's report, filed within the day, cited the light's failure as a contributing cause. The mechanism found seized and long overdue for proper servicing. Servicing the company's own maintenance contract had certified as current not 6 weeks prior. The village gathered at the harbor that morning in a silence Selah hadn't heard from Marham Sands in the whole of her time there. Fishermen standing bareheaded along the tide line while the last body was carried up wrapped in a spare sail. Dorcas closed her stall without a word to anyone. Even Prentice, when Selah passed him near the company office, said nothing at all, his usual careful phrases apparently having deserted him, along with whatever comfort he'd once taken in reminding her to stay quiet. Selah stood on the rocks that morning with Dorcas Wren beside her, watching men carry a 4th body up from the tide line, and felt something in her chest go very still and very cold. "This is what the fraud cost," she said, not quite to Dorcas, not quite to herself, Not simply money skimmed from a widow's fund. This won't be the last wreck on that shoal, if the mechanism's left as it stands. Dorcas's voice had lost its careful neutrality entirely. Whatever quiet arrangements kept this village fed on company contracts, I expect it's about to cost considerably more than anyone here's willing to keep paying. The Coastal Lighting Commission's inspector arrived within the week, summoned by the scale of the wreck rather than by anything Selah herself had managed to arrange. Watching his carriage climb the coast road, she realized the death of 3 sailors had accomplished, in a single night, what 18 months of careful evidence gathering alone might never have forced into daylight. Nathaniel Purcell came to her 2 days after the wreck, his ink-stained hands trembling slightly as he climbed the tower stairs, a canvas-wrapped ledger held against his chest. "I should have shown you this properly the first time you asked," he said. "The fund's founding charter. I've kept a copy these many years, though I never quite found the courage to say why." He unwrapped the bundle to reveal a document older than anything in his office ledgers, its language formal but plain enough to follow. The Mariners' Widows and Orphans Fund had been established 2 generations prior, its principal drawn from subscriptions by shipping families along this coast. Its purpose stood stated plainly in the opening clause: to maintain every light between Marham Sands and the northern point in full and continuous working order, for the safety of all vessels and the relief of those widowed or orphaned by the sea. The maintenance contract with Trent's company came later, Purcell said. A convenience originally, when the fund's trustees decided a single-family firm might manage the technical work more efficiently than the trustees themselves. Trent's father proposed the arrangement, drafted most of its terms himself, if the earliest records are any guide. Selah turned to the charter's final pages, where a schedule of annual disbursements ran alongside a corresponding schedule of certified maintenance completed. The pattern repeated itself year after year, the sums claimed consistently exceeding, by a considerable margin, what her father's notebook proved had actually reached the tower. 2 generations, she said, drawing the fund's income while certifying work barely half performed, and calling every light along this coast fully maintained regardless. "I believe your father discovered the full pattern before either of us, Miss Vane. I found this among papers he'd once asked me to hold safely before he died. Though I confess I didn't understand their significance until considerably later." Purcell's voice dropped further. "I have wondered, more than once these past 18 months, whether holding them safely was the last favor I ever did him." He confronted Trent directly, threatened to bring the fraud before the trustees himself. Selah set the charter beside her father's notebook and the torn letter, and felt the whole account settle at last into something continuous rather than fragments. A week later, he was dead, and his apprentice dismissed the same week, and every page proving the fraud's full extent torn away before anyone else could read them. "You mean to bring this before the Commission's inquiry?" "I mean to bring it before whoever in this county still answers to the sailors who drowned on that shoal 3 nights past, rather than to 2 generations of one family's comfortable arrangement." She wrapped the charter alongside the other evidence, her hands steady despite everything the wreck had cost the village already. "The fund was built to protect this coast, Mr. Purcell. Someone still holds the authority to ask exactly how long the Trent family has been drawing its income while letting the very lights it protects go dark." The inquiry convened in the assembly room above the harbor master's office, larger quarters borrowed for the occasion. Once word of the wreck had drawn considerably more attendance than any routine maintenance review would ever have managed. Selah arrived with her evidence wrapped in oilcloth against her chest, and found the room already fuller than she'd expected for a county this small. Josiah Trent sat near the front, his own papers arranged before him, composed in the particular manner of a man confident the day's proceedings would settle in his favor regardless of what anyone else brought to the table. He rose when the Commission's inspector, a lean, unhurried man named Ambrose Feldwick, called the inquiry to order. "A tragic accident, certainly," Trent said, "though I would caution against laying the whole of it at my company's door. Storms of this severity test even the soundest mechanisms. Sound mechanisms don't seize entirely after 6 weeks of certified servicing, Selah said. And every face in the room turned toward her. This mechanism hadn't been properly maintained by your company in 18 months, Mr. Trent. It ran at all only because my father, and later his apprentice, kept it working unofficially, without pay, without your knowledge. Or so you'd have this commission believe. I have no knowledge of any unauthorized interference with company equipment. You had Mr. Renwick summoned before the county magistrate on a charge of theft, the same fortnight he might have testified to precisely that interference. Selah let the silence that followed carry its own weight. I never mentioned his name to your office before that summons arrived. I never told anyone in this room until this morning. Micah rose from a bench near the side wall, where he'd sat unnoticed since the proceedings opened. I can speak to it directly, Mr. Feldwick, if the commission will permit it. I serviced that mechanism myself, without company knowledge or company pay. Every week for the better part of 18 months, because I'd apprenticed under Edwin Vane and couldn't in conscience watch his work seize while ships still ran that shoal at night. And the charge brought against you? Filed the same week, Miss Vane began asking questions of the company's clerk. I'll leave the commission to draw whatever conclusion it finds fitting from the timing. Micah sat again once Feldwick had noted the statement, his hands steady now in a way Selah hadn't seen them since the summons first arrived at her workshop door. A murmur moved through the assembly. Feldwick looked up from the charter Purcell had already placed before him. Mr. Trent, this document shows your company certifying full maintenance sums for work your own records. By Mr. Purcell's account, cannot substantiate as completed. Can you account for the discrepancy? Clerical variance. Nothing more. Maintenance costs fluctuate year to year. Then perhaps you can explain, Selah said, why my father's own notebook, kept in this tower and torn through deliberately before I found it, documents that same discrepancy in detail, and why he confronted you directly about it. By his own written account, 1 week before his death, was ruled his own carelessness. She set the notebook before Feldwick, the torn letter beside it. My father discovered your family had drawn full maintenance income from the Widows and Orphans Fund for 2 generations while performing barely half the work certified. He meant to bring it before the trustees. He never had the chance. Trent's composure held, though his hand moved once to the signet ring on his smallest finger, turning it without apparent thought, the same small motion Selah had noticed the very first evening he'd set his offer on her table. This is speculation built upon a dead man's private grievance. It's a dead man's grievance detailed enough to match, page for page, the charter your own father drafted and the ledger your own clerk has kept faithfully all these years. Feldwick closed the charter with evident finality. Mr. Trent, I am suspending your company's maintenance contract effective immediately, pending a full audit of every light under its administration for the past 20 years. You will provide complete records of every sum drawn from the fund since your father first proposed the arrangement. This is a grieving daughter's fantasy, dressed up as an audit, Trent said, though the room had already turned against him, decisively and altogether, and something in his voice had lost whatever certainty it carried when he'd first risen to speak. It's 3 drowned sailors' grievance, Selah said, and a fraud 2 families have profited from since before I was born. She met his eyes steadily, and for the first time since he'd set his offer on her table, she watched him look away first. You assumed a torn notebook and a dead man's silence would be the end of it. You never once accounted for a daughter who understood clockwork well enough to notice exactly what your company had let seize. The commission's audit took the better part of 4 months, considerably longer than any inquiry this coast had previously required, and confirmed everything the torn notebook and the recovered charter had implied. The Trent Maritime Lighting Company had drawn full maintenance sums from the fund for the better part of 2 decades while completing, by the auditor's own careful estimate, considerably less than half the certified work across every light under its administration. Josiah Trent was removed from the contract before the audit concluded, the fund's trustees voting to administer future maintenance directly rather than through any private company arrangement again. He did not attend the final hearing, the one that mattered to Selah rather less than the first. Purcell reported that Trent had sold his remaining interest in the family firm within the month and left the county entirely. His name struck from every document the fund's trustees now controlled outright. It was not ruin exactly. It was something quieter and more complete. A family's carefully maintained arrangement, finally too exposed to keep drawing income from anyone's trust. The charge against Micah was withdrawn. The same week the audit's preliminary findings became public, the county magistrate dismissing it without ceremony, once the commission's own evidence made the original accusation impossible to sustain. He climbed the coast road to find Selah still working through her father's notebook, cataloging every entry properly now that the fear of it being seized or torn further had finally lifted. "Charges gone," he said simply, standing in the workshop doorway. "Clean record." And an apology from the magistrate's clerk that I doubt he meant, especially sincerely. I heard the same from Purcell. Fund's trustees are hiring direct now. Proper wages, proper indentures. The mechanism serviced weekly by contract, rather than by whatever a dismissed apprentice could manage on stolen evenings. He studied her, the question sitting plainly enough beneath his words that neither of them needed to name it outright. They've asked after a keeper's mechanic for Gannett Scar specifically, someone who already knows this drive better than any new man they might otherwise hire. I told you I wouldn't let this fight cost you your future along this coast. You didn't cost me anything. The fund's paying properly now, out of money that was always meant to reach this tower and finally will. He allowed himself something close to a smile. Unless you've decided you'd rather manage the mechanism entirely alone, now that it's honestly yours to keep. I've decided nothing of the kind. She set down her father's notebook and looked at him properly, understanding for the first time in 18 months that the ground beneath this particular decision had finally stopped shifting. There's a workbench here with your name half worn into the drawer pull already. Seems a waste to break in a different one. The repairs took the better part of a season, the fund's own money finally reaching materials her father had gone without for years. Proper oil. Replacement gears ordered honestly from London rather than improvised from whatever scrap the tower could offer. A new lens ground, and fitted to replace the one Trent's neglect had left permanently cracked. Purcell arranged for a small brass plate to be set into the lamp room wall at the fund's own expense, engraved simply, "Edwin Vane, engineer, who kept this light running when others would not." Selah stood before it the morning it was fixed in place, her father's tool roll open on the bench behind her. She felt considerably less triumph than a kind of settling. The particular quiet that comes after carrying something heavy long enough that setting it down finally feels earned rather than merely possible. Word came that autumn that the wreck's survivors and the families of the 3 men lost had been granted relief directly from the reformed fund, the first disbursement made under trustees who administered it themselves, rather than through any company's convenient arrangement. Selah read the notice twice, standing in the doorway of the workshop that had become, somewhere across the past year, unmistakably her own. That evening she climbed to the lamp room with Micah beside her, not in secret this time, not by stolen hours snatched between a company's notice. They wound the mechanism together in the last of the daylight, each taking a turn at the crank the way her father had once taught them both, separately, without either knowing the other, had learned the same lesson from the same patient hands. The lens caught the last of the sun as it turned, throwing a brief, brilliant arc across water that had claimed 3 lives it need never have taken. Watching the light settle into its steady evening rhythm, Selah knew her father's real inheritance had never been the tower itself, or the mechanism, or even the fraud she'd finally proven. It had been the plain, stubborn insistence that a light worth building was worth maintaining honestly, whatever it cost. The men who'd rather it simply went quiet instead. She closed her father's tool roll for the night and set it on the shelf beside the brass plate bearing his name, leaving it there for the first time since his death. She would need it again come morning. But tonight, at least, the light no longer depended on anyone hiding.